May 20th, 1999. A disused bank in a tiny wheat town 2 hours north of Adelaide, South Australia. The town is called Snowtown. Barely 1,000 people, a main street, a pub, and an old branch of the state bank that closed years ago and has been sitting empty ever since. Except it isn't empty. When police get the search warrant and walk into the old bank, the first thing that reaches them isn't a sight. It's a smell, the kind of smell that makes seasoned officers stop in the doorway and steady themselves before they go any further. They follow it to the vault, the heavy steel room where the bank once kept its money, the room with the thick door and no windows. And inside they find barrels, black plastic barrels, the kind you'd use for chemicals or farm supplies. Several of them. There are bodies in the barrels. More than one, more than two. Dissolved, in various states, in acid. By the time forensic teams finish their work in that small room, they will have counted the remains of 8 human beings inside it. And that number isn't even the whole story, because while they're working in Snowtown, other officers are digging in a backyard in the suburbs and finding more. Here's the thing the headlines would get slightly wrong forever after. Almost nobody was actually killed in Snowtown. The town just had the bad luck of owning an empty bank vault with a thick door, rented quietly by a man who needed somewhere to store what he'd done. The real horror happened over 7 years, in ordinary houses, in the working-class suburbs north of Adelaide, and the people who did it weren't strangers to their victims. They were friends, partners, in-laws, family, and the man at the center of it believed, all the way down, that he was one of the good guys, that he was cleaning up the world, that every single person in those barrels had it coming. That's the part I can't get past. Not the barrels, the certainty. Intent doesn't lie. People do. I'm Carman Carrion, and this is Deadly Intent. I need to give you a real warning before we go any further, and I mean it more than usual tonight. This is one of the most brutal cases I've ever covered. There was prolonged cruelty. There were victims who suffered in ways I'm not going to detail on this show, because the point of Deadly Intent has never been to make you flinch. It's to help you understand. So I'm going to tell you what happened and why it happened, and I'm going to leave the worst specifics in the case file where they belong. If you've heard the rumors about this one, you can trust that the restraint is mine on purpose. If you can't go to a dark place tonight, step out. No judgment. I'll see you next week. For those of you staying, here's why this case matters to the question we ask every single episode. Most of the killers we talk about know, on some level, that what they're doing is wrong. They hide it. They lie about it. The lie is the tale. But Snowtown is different, and that difference is the whole reason it haunts me. The man at the heart of it didn't think he was a killer at all. He thought he was a kind of soldier, an exterminator of bad people. He built an entire moral system in his head where murder wasn't murder. It was justice. And then he pulled other men into that system, one at a time, until they believed it too. So tonight isn't really a story about how a man kills. It's a story about how a man convinces himself, and then convinces a small circle of followers, that killing is the right thing to do. It's a story about a dominant personality and the vulnerable people who orbit one. And once you understand how that machine gets built, how the parts fit together, how it recruits, how it escalates, you start to see smaller, quieter versions of it everywhere. Because the most dangerous intent in the world isn't the intent that knows it's evil. It's the intent that's absolutely certain it's good. Let me set the scene properly, because the geography of this case has confused people for 25 years. The murders happened in and around Adelaide, specifically in the working-class northern suburbs, places like Salisbury North and Elizabeth, where money was tight, jobs were scarce, and a lot of vulnerable people were trying to get by on disability and unemployment payments. That's where the killers lived. That's where the victims lived. That's where almost all of it happened. in living rooms and bathrooms of unremarkable houses, behind drawn curtains, on ordinary streets where the neighbors had no idea. Snowtown itself came late, and almost by accident. By the late 1990s, the men responsible had a problem that every long-running killer eventually has. What do you do with the bodies? You can only bury so many in backyards before the ground starts giving up its secrets. And so they rented the vault of that old closed-down bank in a town most Australians had never heard of, 2 hours from the city, and they used it as storage. Barrels, acid, a thick steel door. A quiet place where the smell wouldn't draw a crowd. In a town small enough that nobody asked too many questions about the men who occasionally came and went. So when the world finally learned the name Snowtown, it attached to the wrong thing. The town became shorthand for the whole nightmare. But the town was innocent. Just a place with an empty building and a landlord who had no idea what was being carried in past him. The people of Snowtown have spent 25 years living under a name that isn't really theirs. Their welcome sign, their footy team, their kids' school. All of it now sits under a word that now means acid barrels to the rest of the country. At one point, authorities even discussed renaming the town to escape it. That's how heavy this case sits on a place that had almost nothing to do with it. Now, how did police end up at the vault in the first place? Because this didn't start with the barrels. It started with absence. For years, people have been quietly vanishing from those northern suburbs. Not the kind of people whose disappearance makes the evening news. The isolated, the estranged. People who'd drifted from their families, who had lived on the margins, who might go months without anyone raising an alarm. One here, one there, spread across years. Individually, each one looked like a person who'd simply moved on, dropped out of contact, gone walkabout. That's exactly why it worked for so long. But police missing persons work is patient. And eventually, detectives in Adelaide started noticing a pattern under the noise. The missing kept connecting back, through friendships, through family, through shared addresses, to the same small circle of men. And there was something stranger still. Some of these missing people were still, on paper, alive, still collecting their government payments, still, somehow, drawing money out of the system every fortnight, even though no one had actually laid eyes on them in a very long time. That contradiction, gone but still cashing the checks, is the thread that detectives finally got a grip on. They formed a task force. They put the circle of men under surveillance, and that surveillance led them, in May of 1999, to a rented vault in a closed bank in Snowtown. They got their warrant. They opened the door. And a quiet missing persons puzzle became the worst series of killings in Australian history. At least 11 people murdered over roughly 7 years. Some sources put it at 12, by a group of men who weren't a gang in any traditional sense. They were a family, or something that wore the shape of one. I want to stop on that one word from the cold open, justice, because it's the engine of this entire case. And it's a more common engine than you'd like to believe. Here's a hard truth about human cruelty. Most people cannot do terrible things while believing they're the villain. The conscience gets in the way. It's a real, almost physical resistance. Most of us are wired to recoil from harming another person, to feel the wrongness in our bodies before we can even name it. So in order to do something monstrous, a person usually has to first solve that problem. They have to find a story that turns the monstrous thing into a necessary thing, a righteous thing, a thing the situation demands of them. Psychologists call this moral disengagement, and one of its most powerful forms is what we might call righteous license, the belief that your target deserves it, that they're not really a full person with the same right to live that you have, that hurting them isn't cruelty, it's cleanup, it's hygiene. It's the hard, necessary work that weaker people are too squeamish to do. This is the most dangerous belief a human being can hold, and history proves it at scale. Almost every mass atrocity ever committed was carried out by people who thought they were the heroes, who had been handed a story about a category of people who were dangerous, diseased, subhuman, deserving. The story is the weapon. Once you accept it, the killing feels not just permissible, but good. You sleep fine afterward. You feel cleaner, not dirtier. You feel like you've done something the rest of the world was too cowardly to do. The man at the center of Snowtown ran on exactly this fuel. He told himself, and everyone around him, that his victims were predators, that he was protecting children, protecting the vulnerable, doing the work the law was too weak and too slow to do. And the genius of it, the truly sinister part, is that this story did two things at once. It gave him permission to kill, and it converted his cruelty into virtue, so that the worse he behaved, the more righteous he got to feel. Keep that in your mind as we meet him, because the question that matters most isn't did he believe he was good. He clearly did. The question is whether the belief was the cause of the killing or just the costume it wore. His name was John Bunting. He was born in 1966, and by every account of the people who knew him, he had a presence, a gravity that pulled people toward him. He had had a hard, unstable upbringing, the kind that leaves a person with a lot of rage and not many healthy places to put it. As a younger man, he'd worked for a time in an abattoir, a slaughterhouse, and people who knew him later would point to that almost too neatly. But what's true is that Bunting was a man comfortable with things most people can't stomach, and a man who had learned, early, to turn discomfort into a job to be done. By the time he settled into the northern suburbs of Adelaide, he had become something specific and dangerous. He was charismatic. He was funny. He was certain about everything, but about one thing above all, and he walked into a struggling, isolated community full of people who felt powerless and overlooked, and he offered them the two things they were starving for: certainty and belonging. Bunting had an obsession, and it organized his entire personality. He hated pedophiles. On its face, that's not a remarkable thing to hate. Most people do, and most people are right to. But Bunting's hatred was total, consuming, and crucially distorted. He didn't distinguish between actual child abusers and people he simply found disgusting or deviant or weak. In his mind, pedophiles, gay men, drug users, the disabled, the overweight, these categories blurred together into a single contaminated class of people he called by a slur. People he had decided the world would be better without. He treated being gay as interchangeable with being a predator. He treated weakness itself as a kind of guilt. He had built in his own head a hierarchy of who got to count as human, and he had placed an enormous number of people below the line. And he kept a wall in his home. Bunting maintained what investigators would later describe as a kind of chart, names, connected by lines and string, of people he believed were pedophiles or undesirables, mapping out who knew whom, who was connected to whom, a web of targets. He'd sit and study it like a project. He recruited others into the work of identifying who belonged on it, who deserved to be added. He turned a private hatred into a system, with research and record-keeping and a growing list of names. That's not the behavior of a man in a sudden rage. That's the behavior of a man building an institution. Now here is where it becomes a group case rather than a single killer case, and where the psychology gets genuinely frightening. Bunting didn't act alone. He gathered a small circle of men around him, and he shaped them. There was Robert Wagner, a younger man who became Bunting's most devoted partner in the killings, and absorbed his worldview almost completely, who took Bunting's hatreds and made them his own, with terrifying conviction. There was Mark Hayden, older, on the edges of the inner circle, who would help with the practical aftermath, the vehicles, the storage, the cover-up, and whose own wife would end up among the dead. And most heartbreakingly, there was a teenager named James Vlasakis. James was the son of the woman Bunting was living with, effectively Bunting's stepson. He was a vulnerable, damaged young person from a chaotic background, the kind of kid who had had very little stability and was desperate for a strong figure to belong to. And Bunting became that figure, He moved into the role of the dominant man in that boy's life, and then he used it. And he didn't just gather them, he bound them. This is something investigators and psychologists came to understand about how Bunting operated. He made the men around him complicit, deliberately, so that none of them could ever cleanly walk away. He drew them into the talk before the acts, into the planning before the violence, into the cover-up after it, so that each man had his own stake in the secret, his own reason to keep it. Shared guilt is a leash. Once you've crossed the line beside someone, you can't testify against them without testifying against yourself. And Bunting understood that arithmetic perfectly. He didn't only recruit followers, he manufactured accomplices who were trapped by their own hands. Bunting was the sun, the others orbited, and the closer they got, the more of his reality they took on as their own, until the line between his certainty and theirs simply disappeared. This is the part of Snowtown I want you to most understand, because it's the part that explains how ordinary men, not cartoon monsters, ordinary, damaged men, ended up doing the unthinkable. It's the psychology of the dominant personality and the followers who form around him. When clinicians describe a distorted worldview passed from one dominant person to others, they sometimes reach for an old phrase, folie à plusieurs, the madness of several. One forceful, certain individual generates a warped reality, and the people in close, dependent, isolated proximity to that person gradually adopt it as their own. It doesn't require that the followers start out evil. It requires that they're vulnerable, that they're isolated, that they need belonging badly enough to trade their own judgment for it, and that the dominant figure offers them a story that makes them feel powerful and righteous instead of small and discarded. Look at who Bunting collected. A struggling, devoted younger man, a damaged teenage stepson who'd had a hard, unstable life, people on the margins, without strong anchors, without other voices in their ears to say this is insane, walk away. Bunting became those missing voices' replacement. He became the source of meaning, the source of approval, the source of identity itself. And once a person's entire sense of who they are is wired into one dominant figure, once that figure is the only one who makes them feel like they matter, that figure can move them almost anywhere, including across the line that should be impossible to cross. There's a second mechanic that the group itself provides, and it's called diffusion of responsibility. Alone, a person feels the full crushing weight of what they're doing. In a group, that weight gets divided up until no one's carrying all of it. I only held him down. He's the one who actually... We all agreed it had to happen. The crime becomes a shared object that no single set of hands feels fully responsible for. The group doesn't just enable the violence, it lowers the floor on what each individual member is capable of, because the shame is split too many ways to stop anyone. And it escalates. This is the cruelest part. The first crossing is the hardest one. Every nerve in a normal person screams against it. But the second is easier. The third is easier still. What was once unthinkable becomes uncomfortable, then routine, then simply the thing they do. That's how you get from one angry man with a wall of names to 7 years of bodies. Not in a single leap. In a long, group-greased, righteous-fueled slide, where each step is only slightly worse than the last, until you look up and you're renting a vault for the barrels. The intent didn't multiply by accident. It was recruited. Now, I have to tell you the truth that detonates Bunting's entire story, and it's the most important fact in this whole case. The victims were not who he said they were. Bunting's justification, the engine of righteousness we just talked about, was that he was killing pedophiles, protecting children, ridding the world of predators. But when investigators actually examined who died, that story collapsed completely. The victims of Snowtown were, overwhelmingly, not child abusers. They were vulnerable people from the killer's own orbit. Friends, acquaintances, former partners, members of their own extended family, people with disabilities, people struggling with addiction, People who were isolated or poor or gay or trans or simply inconvenient and unlikely to be quickly missed. Let me give a few of them back their names, because they were people before they were a body count. The first to die back in 1992 was a young man named Clinton Trezise. He was just 22. He was killed in a house in the suburbs, years before the group had fully formed. An early, almost prototype murder. His body was buried in a field, and when it was eventually found a couple of years later, no one could identify him. For years he was just an unknown young man in the ground, a John Doe, until this investigation finally connected the bones to a name. 22 years old, and he spent years as a mystery because the people who killed him had counted on no one caring enough to ask. There was Barry Lane, who had once been close to the killers themselves, connected to that inner circle, then turned on by it. Bunting's homophobia and his ever-shifting suspicions made even his own associates unsafe. Being near Bunting was never protection. It was proximity to a man always looking for the next name to add to the wall. There was Thomas Trevelyan, a troubled and vulnerable young man, whose death the group tried to disguise, staged to look like a suicide, a hanging, so that no one would come looking for a killer at all. That's the cold competence underneath the supposed crusade. They didn't just kill, they engineered the aftermath, dressing murder up as something the world would shrug at. There was Elizabeth Hayden, who was the wife of one of the group's own members. Sit with that. A woman murdered, and one of the men responsible for the cover-up was her own husband. These were not predators hunted down to protect children. These were people the killers knew and ate with and lived beside and then destroyed. And then there was the money, because underneath all the righteous rhetoric was something far more ordinary and far more damning. When each victim died, they didn't fully disappear from the system. The group kept collecting their government welfare and disability payments. They kept the bank cards, they kept the pins, they impersonated the dead, forged the contact, kept up the fiction that these people were still alive and still owed their fortnightly money. There's evidence that some victims, before they died, were forced to provide details, even to record phone messages that would help the killers keep that money flowing afterward. The crusade against pedophiles had a revenue stream. The bodies in those barrels were, to the men who put them there, also paychecks. And think about what that fraud actually required, day to day, because it tells you everything about the gap between the rhetoric and the reality. To keep a dead person's payments flowing, you have to maintain the illusion that they're alive. Not once, but every fortnight, indefinitely. You have to know their details, hold their cards, answer for them, account for them. It's not a crime of passion. It's bookkeeping. It's administration. These men sat down and did the patient clerical work of impersonating the people they killed, week after week, year after year, so the money would keep arriving. A crusade doesn't keep ledgers. A business does. And the longer it ran, the more victims it could absorb, because every new missing person was also a new income stream, which meant the killing and the earning fed each other, each murder quietly solving the problem of the last one while creating the cover for the next. The last victim, in May of 1999, was a young man named David Johnson. He was connected to the group itself, a relative by the tangled family ties that ran through this whole circle. He was lured to that very bank in Snowtown under a pretext, an everyday errand, a reason to make the drive. He didn't know what the building held. He didn't know he was the last name on a long list. And it was the threads around his killing and around the disappearance of Elizabeth Hayden that finally pulled the whole structure down on top of the men who built it. Let's do the thing this show exists to do. Let's separate stated intent from actual intent, because Snowtown is a master class in the difference. Stated intent. I am ridding the world of pedophiles. I am protecting children. I am doing necessary righteous work that the law is too weak to do. Actual intent, as revealed by the behavior. I am killing people I know and dislike and find beneath me, many of whom have nothing whatsoever to do with children. I am keeping their money. I am exercising total power over a small circle of followers who worship me. I am, underneath all the rhetoric, getting something I crave: control, significance, dominance, and a steady fortnightly income. Here's the principle. And it's one of the most useful things you'll ever learn about reading intent. When someone's stated motive is noble, but their behavior consistently serves their self-interest, believe the behavior. The righteous story is what they need to be true about themselves. The pattern of who they actually hurt and what they actually gain is what is true. Run Bunting against that test. If he were truly a crusader against child abuse, the victims would have been child abusers. They weren't. If it were about protecting the innocent, there'd be no profit motive. There was a substantial one, running for years. If it were about justice, it wouldn't have required grooming a teenager and dominating a circle of dependent men to carry it out. It did. Every single place where the noble story and the actual conduct disagree, the conduct is the one telling truth. And this matters far beyond Snowtown, because the righteous cover pattern is everywhere, usually in smaller, perfectly legal forms. The person who tears others down for their own good, the one whose cruelty always arrives dressed as honesty or principle, as standards, as justice. The mask of virtue is the most effective mask there is, precisely because it makes the rest of us hesitate to look underneath. Because who are we to question someone who's only trying to do the right thing? Snowtown is what's underneath that mask, taken all the way to its end. Intent doesn't lie, but it will happily wear a halo if you let it. For 7 years, the group got away with it, and the reason is bleak. Their victims were people society wasn't watching closely. When you deliberately target the isolated, the addicted, the disabled, the estranged, people whose absence raises no immediate alarm, you buy yourself time. The welfare fraud bought even more, because on paper the victims were still alive, still collecting, still around. A person who's still cashing checks isn't a missing person. He's just someone you haven't happened to see lately. But two things finally broke the silence. The first was Elizabeth Hayden's disappearance in late 1998, because here, finally, was a victim who didn't fit the profile of someone no one would miss. She had family. She had people who expected to hear from her, who noticed the silence, who started asking the men around her where she had gone, and who didn't accept the vague, shifting answers they got back. That pressure put the inner circle, and particularly the men closest to her, under a kind of scrutiny they had always managed to avoid with more isolated victims. A family that refuses to stop asking, is one of the most powerful forces in any of these cases. It was here. Here's what the record shows. Elizabeth Hayden was 37, Mark Hayden's wife and Frederick Brooks' aunt. Bunting was told by Hayden that he had informed his wife about the murders. Once Bunting knew she was aware of the killings, she became a liability to him. Bunting detested Elizabeth and warned Velasquez that she was a problem because she knew about the killings, and Wagner held similar contempt for her. So in November 1998, while her husband and children were out for the night, Bunting and Wagner came to her home and killed her, and her body was placed in a barrel. That's the grim distinction worth drawing for the episode. Most of the victims were killed for who Bunting imagined they were. Supposed pedophiles, gay men, weak people, picked off the wall of names. Elizabeth was killed for what she actually was. Her own husband had let it slip that he had told her about the murders, and that knowledge alone was a death sentence in that group. It's one of the clearest proofs that the crusade was never the real organizing principle when self-preservation required it. They killed a woman who fit none of the categories, simply to keep her quiet. And there's a detail that captures the moral void at the center of this better than almost anything else in this case. When Mark Hayden was reportedly shown his wife's remains afterward, he laughed. It was police inquiries into Elizabeth Hayden's disappearance that eventually led them to Snowtown. She had family who pushed. Her sister was even engaged to Bunting. So unlike the more isolated victims, her absence got noticed. The thing they killed her to hide is the very thing that exposed all of it. The second thing was the slow, patient accumulation of pattern in the missing persons files. Detectives working disappearances across Adelaide's north kept finding that the vanished connected back to the same handful of names, the same addresses, the same tangled web of relationships. A dedicated task force formed. They began serious surveillance on the circle of men, watching their movements, their meetings, the places they went that they had no obvious reason to go. The threads tightened, and eventually all of it pointed to a rented vault in a closed bank in a town 2 hours away that none of these men had any innocent reason to be visiting. When officers opened the vault on May 20th, 1999, the missing persons cases became a homicide investigation of a scale the country had never seen. 8 sets of remains in the barrels, more bodies recovered elsewhere, including from a backyard tied to Bunting back in the suburbs. The unidentified young man in a field years earlier, Clinton Trezise, finally given his name. Piece by piece, the full toll assembled itself. At least 11 victims, possibly 12, across 7 years. And I want to be clear about the scale of the work that followed, because it's part of the story of how the truth finally got out. Identifying the dead, after acid and time had done what they do, was painstaking forensic labor. Dental records, bone analysis, the slow matching of remains to the missing persons files that had quietly accumulated for years. Investigators weren't just confirming that people were dead. They were rebuilding, piece by piece, a 7-year timeline that the killers had spent enormous effort erasing. Who died when, in what order, and how each disappearance had been papered over at the time. Every staged suicide, every "he moved interstate," every forged signature on a benefits form had to be pulled apart and reassembled into the real sequence of events. It was one of the most complex forensic undertakings the state had ever mounted, and it's the reason the case stood up in court at all. The men who did this had counted on the victims being unidentifiable and the timeline being untraceable. They were nearly right. What undid them was the patience of people who refused to accept that a human being could simply evaporate. The arrests came quickly, and then the case entered a phase that was, in its own way, almost as extraordinary as the crimes, because the legal aftermath became one of the longest, most complex, and most expensive criminal proceedings in Australian history. Before we get to the trials, I want to stop on the youngest of them, because James Velasquez is the key that unlocks the whole psychology of this case, and the hardest person in it to hold in your mind. Here's the difficulty. James Velasquez was a killer. He pleaded guilty to 4 murders. That's real, and I'm not going to soften it. But James Velasquez was also, in a very real sense, one of Bunting's victims. And both of those things are true at the same time. And the law itself had to find a way to hold them together. Think about who he was when Bunting got to him. A teenager, a boy from a chaotic, painful background, who had already known instability and harm before this man ever walked into his mother's life. He didn't choose Bunting. Bunting arrived as the dominant adult male in a household at exactly the age when a vulnerable kid is desperate for a strong figure to attach to belong to be approved of by. And Bunting, a master at finding the unanchored and reeling them in, recognized that hunger and fed it, and then weaponized it. This is how grooming into violence works, and it's worth saying plainly because it's so often misunderstood. It is not one dramatic moment of corruption. It's a slow inversion of a young person's entire moral world, conducted by someone they trust and depend on and fear losing. The dominant figure becomes the source of right and wrong itself. Approval flows for going along, withdrawal and contempt and danger flow for resisting. And for a dependent kid with nowhere else to stand, that approval becomes oxygen. By the time the unthinkable is being asked of him, the machinery to refuse it has already been dismantled, replaced piece by piece with the dominant man's reality. None of this makes him not responsible. He was. He knew and he did it, and he was sentenced for it. But it explains the mechanism, and the mechanism is the whole point of this show. Velasquez is what it looks like when intent isn't generated from inside a person, but installed from outside. When a stronger, colder mind finds a weaker, wounded one and reshapes it into a tool, he is the clearest proof of how Bunting's machine actually worked, because in him you can still see the seams. And in the end, it was Velasquez who broke it open, which brings us back to the trials. The case against the Snowtown killers was buried at first under secrecy. Courts imposed an extraordinary number of suppression orders, at one point reportedly more than 250 of them, restricting what could be reported, partly to protect the integrity of the trials and the surviving, deeply tangled people caught up in it. For a long time, the full story simply could not be told in public. The country knew the barrels existed. It did not yet know the half of what they meant. And the case cracked open from the inside. James Velasquez, the stepson, the youngest, the most clearly groomed and dominated of them all, pleaded guilty and agreed to testify against the others. His account from inside the machine gave prosecutors the narrative thread they needed to walk a jury through 7 years of carefully hidden violence. It cost him enormously to do it. His time in custody was marked by genuine crisis, but this testimony was the spine of the case. The trial of Bunting and Wagner that followed was a marathon, one of the longest in the nation's legal history, running the better part of a year at staggering expense. And in 2003, the verdicts came down. John Bunting, the architect, the man with the wall, was convicted of 11 murders. His closest partner, Robert Wagner, was convicted of murder on a scale just below him. Mark Hayden, in proceedings that followed, was convicted not of the murders themselves, but of his role in helping to deal with the bodies and cover the crimes up. Here is where everyone stands now, more than 25 years after the vault was opened. John Bunting received 11 terms of life imprisonment, with no possibility of parole. He will die in prison. Australia decided, as plainly as a justice system can, that this is a man who must never, under any circumstances, walk free again. Robert Wagner is also serving life without parole. He, too, is never getting out. James Velasquez, the stepson who turned and testified, received 4 life sentences with a long non-parole period, set at 26 years, a sentence that tried, imperfectly, to hold both of the truths about him, his genuine guilt, and the reality of what had been done to him to produce it. And then there's Mark Hayden. He received a finite sentence, 25 years, for his role in the cover-up rather than the killings. And here's the development that makes this an episode about now and not just about the past. Hayden completed that sentence. In May of 2024, after 25 years, he was released from prison into the community under a strict extended supervision order, monitored and conditioned, but free in a way the others never will be. The victims' families fought it. The public recoiled. South Australia moved to strengthen its law around high-risk offenders in direct response. But the sentence was the sentence, and it ran out. And a man connected to the worst killings in the nation's history walked back out into the world. It's worth pausing on what this case did to a whole country. Australia is not a place that thinks of itself as a setting for this kind of horror, and Snowtown landed like a wound in the national psyche. It forced uncomfortable questions that went well beyond the men in the dock. How does a person vanish for years while the state keeps mailing their money? How do a dozen people slip out of the world without the systems meant to catch that? Welfare, policing, community, registering the loss. The answer, the bleak everyone had to sit with, was that the victims were precisely the people those systems were already failing. They were poor, or disabled, or addicted, or estranged, or marginalized for who they loved or how they lived. The killers didn't defeat society's safety net. They found the holes that were already there, the people already falling through, and they moved in. That's a harder thing to face than a single monster, because it implicates more than one man. The town of Snowtown is still called Snowtown. It still carries a name it never earned. The old bank still stands. The case has been told in books, and in a 2011 film so unflinching that many people genuinely cannot finish it. But the men are accounted for. 2 will die behind bars. 1 is serving decades, and 1 is out, watched, in a country that never stopped being afraid of him. I want to bring the analysis home to the single most important takeaway from this entire case, because it's the one that can actually protect you. The most dangerous people are almost never the ones who announce themselves as cruel. The cartoon villain who says, "I am evil and I love it," basically doesn't exist outside of movies. Real, sustained, large-scale cruelty almost always comes wearing the costume of the good man, the protector, the one who's only doing what's necessary, the one who's cleaning things up, the one who has decided that some category of people has forfeited their humanity, and who feels righteous, even proud, about acting on it. John Bunting is the purest example I can offer you. He did not skulk in the shadows feeling like a monster. He stood in the light feeling like a hero. He built a worldview where his victims deserved it, gathered followers who needed desperately to believe in something, and ran 7 years of murder on the clean burning fuel of certainty. The certainty is what let him sleep. The certainty is what he handed to the men around him like a gift. Here, stand with me, and you'll be one of the righteous ones too. So when you're trying to read the intent of a person, any person, here is the warning Snowtown leaves us with. Be most careful of the one who is absolutely sure they're good, and who has decided that a whole category of other people are not fully human. That specific combination, righteousness fused with dehumanization, is the most lethal compound in the human psyche. It has burned down nations. It has filled mass graves. In Snowtown, on a smaller and more intimate scale, it filled a bank vault with barrels. Doubt is not weakness. The ability to wonder whether you might be wrong, the capacity to see the full humanity in someone you despise, that is one of the only things standing between any of us and the worst version of ourselves. Bunting never had it. Not a flicker. That's not a side detail in this story. That's the whole disease. Intent doesn't lie. And the intent that calls itself justice, while it quietly preys on the weak and pockets their money, is the most practiced liar of them all. I always close by coming back to the people the story is really about, and tonight that matters more than usual, because the men who killed them spent years telling the world these victims were garbage. They were not. Bunting got to write the story for a while. He doesn't get to keep it. The people who died in this case were overwhelmingly the vulnerable, people living with disability, people struggling with addiction, people who were isolated or poor or gay or trans or simply within reach of the wrong man, the exact people a healthy society is supposed to protect most, and instead they were chosen because they were unguarded, because the world was already half looking away. That's not a reflection on them. It's an indictment of the men who hunted them, and a quieter indictment of all the ways these people were already being overlooked, long before the killers ever found them. Clinton Trezise, Ray Davies, Suzanne Allen, Michael Gardner, Barry Lane, Thomas Trevelyan, Gavin Porter, Troy Yude, Frederick Brooks, Gary O'Dwyer, Elizabeth Hayden, David Johnson. Names that spent years suppressed, reduced to barrel numbers, to case file entries, to a body in a field with no identity. They were whole people. They had childhoods and habits and people who loved them. Several of their families spent decades fighting just to have them named out loud, just to have them counted as human beings, rather than as evidence in the worst case the country had ever seen. I'm not going to describe how they died. I've told you it was terrible. That is enough. And the details belong to them and to the people who love them, not to us. There's a 2011 film about this case. It's called Snowtown, released in some places as The Snowtown Murders, and it's so unflinching that a lot of people simply can't finish it. I'll mention it because some of you will want to understand this more deeply, and it does the psychology justice. But I'll say this too. If you do watch it to understand, not to be entertained. There's a difference, and these 12 people are the reason the difference matters. What I want you to carry out of here is who they were before a man with a wall of names decided they didn't count. They counted. Every single one of them counted, and the fact that they were easy to overlook is precisely the reason we should refuse, now, to look away. Say their names. That's the one thing we can still give them that Bunting tried so hard to take. There's one other thing I want you to take from tonight. Evil rarely knows it's evil. The Snowtown killings weren't carried out by men cackling in the dark. They were carried out by a dominant man who believed he was righteous, and a small circle of broken, dependent followers who borrowed that belief because it made them feel, finally, like they mattered, like they were soldiers in something instead of nobodies in a forgotten suburb. The intent was never really about protecting children. The behavior gave it away. The victims who fit no crusade. The money quietly collected from the dead, the teenager groomed into a weapon, the bodies dissolved and stored like inventory. Strip off the righteous costume, and what's underneath is the oldest thing in the world. A man who wanted total power over other people and found a story that let him take it while feeling clean. We study this not because we enjoy being horrified, though we are, but to learn the shape of it, the certainty that can't tolerate a doubt, the dehumanizing of a whole group of people, the recruitment of the vulnerable and the unanchored, the slow escalation that turns the unthinkable into the routine. These are the warning signs, and they don't only appear in bank vaults in small Australian towns. They appear in smaller doses. Anywhere a charismatic person decides that some category of people doesn't count and gathers an audience willing to nod along. 11 people, maybe 12, were treated as disposable by men who genuinely believed they were heroes. They weren't disposable. They weren't a cleanup. They were the point we keep missing. Intent doesn't lie. People do. I'm Carman Carrion. Take care of each other, especially the ones nobody else is watching out for. Thank you for listening to Deadly Intent. That was a heavy one, and it left a mark. That's honest. It should. This case lives at the intersection of a lot of pain. Violence against vulnerable people, against people targeted for who they were, against people the world had already have turned away from. If anything in it stirred something up in you, please reach out to someone you trust or to a support line in your area. You don't have to carry the heavy stuff alone, and you don't have to be in crisis to deserve a hand. If there's a case you want me to take into the Deadly Intent room, you know where to find me. And if this one meant something to you, share it with one person. That's how this show keeps going, one recommendation at a time. Until next time, intent doesn't lie, people do.